So welcome everybody, and I'll ask the Deputy Chair, Councillor Sanson, to open us with a karakia.
Kia ora koutou. Tuia ki runga, tuia ki raro, tuia ki roto, tuia ki wāhau, tuia tātou te tangata, ki te kaupapa o te hui nei, ki te kaupapa o te rangi nei. Māori ora ki a tātou katoa. Kia ora.
Thank you. Welcome everybody, including those on Zoom. Now, I'd just like to remind everybody that when you speak, please put your microphones on, and when you stop speaking, turn them off, because otherwise it doesn't work on Zoom. And if you don't have your microphone on, then they can't hear you. The meeting is being recorded and will be available on Council's YouTube channel. I presume that's both councils.
Just yours.
Just us? Yeah, right. Toilets and fire exits are out the door. Now, we do have the media present. We've got Catherine Hubbard on Zoom, and we've got Max over here in the corner. So just be aware of that. This is topical. Now, I don't think we have any apologies because I believe we're all here. No apologies. So I'll call for declarations of interest. No forestry owners. No. No late items. Now I'll move to the confirmation of the previous minutes. Would somebody like to move that they... Thank you, Councillor. Seconder. Thanks, Councillor Kinnamoth. All those in favour? Aye. Carried. So we'll move on now to the reports. And I'll hand it over to staff to introduce the report.
Kia ora. Do you need me to introduce everyone here? You know everyone? Hopefully.
I think that seeing this is a joint committee meeting, I think it would be useful for everybody because we've got staff from the different councils.
Yeah. So, sorry. So my name's Gwynnie Coleman. I'm the team leader Biosecurity Biodiversity, and we have Richard Frizzell, who is a biosecurity advisor, Nelson City Council. I hope I'm getting your titles right. And Phil Cochran, who's the team leader for
Biodiversity Biosecurity.
Biodiversity Biosecurity, there you go, at Nelson City Council. And Peter Russell, who we've contracted in to help us with this work. The report, basically we've presented the report with all of the proposed changes for feral cats and for wild and conifers, because those have been the main changes in separate marked up versions. Hopefully that will make it a little bit easier for you to work through and understand where we've made the changes, and we're happy to help step you through those changes, and they're in response to all of the submissions that we received. So overall we received trying to remember 103 submissions, and the vast majority have in terms of blue passion flower, bone seed, moth plant, pampas, Vietnamese parsley, water celery we have recommended that the changes that we have proposed originally basically stay the same, because we haven't received submissions that have told us otherwise. And the main changes have come through with Sabella, pest conifers, and feral and stray cats in response to those submissions and in response to the hearings. Not sure how you would like to work through those.
So I think maybe if we start, we work through the the different parts of the resolution, and I think probably if people, that's probably the best framework to use because you've got a detailed resolution. And if everyone's okay with that, we don't have to move them now. I mean, there's always room for somebody to move the resolution, but I think probably the best thing is for us to just say, are there any questions, to take questions on the resolutions, really starting from the top.
I'm wondering if it would be possible for the staff to talk through the key areas where there are changes, like maybe starting with Sabella, which I think is probably, less comprehensive, and then maybe the feral cats, and then maybe the wilding conifers, because I feel like there's been significant number of changes in the latter two, and it would be quite helpful to be able to kind of deal with them by, rather than jumping around, kind of conifers question, then a cats one, then Sabella. Would it be possible for staff to kind of give us, maybe start with one and talk us through the changes, and then we can ask questions about that particular area? Is that an option?
Yes.
Is that okay?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of going about it. Just a rundown then on the starting with Sabella.
We'll start. So Sabella actually is the rule explanation is the part that we've changed rather than the original rule, and that is around bringing in a exemption for vessels that are normally moored in Nelson, Tasman. So what we're proposing is a level of fouling rule for vessels coming into Tasman, and that rule would not be Nelson and Tasman. That would not be the rule would not be for vessels normally moored here, because that's a low risk. But we do have someone might choose to sail to the Marlborough Sounds for a long weekend and have them be able to come home and not have the rule triggered. So our previous explanation to the rule, I think, said 24 hours leaving the district and coming back, and we've, in response to a submission, extended that to 3 calendar days. So it just gives people a chance to go somewhere where we think is low risk, like the Sounds, and come back and not have the rule triggered, but it is not so long that they could sail to the likes of Littleton Harbour or Auckland and bring back a pest by triggering that rule.
So should we take questions now on Sabella? Anyone got any question? Go.
I don't know about this pest. I know we got on Deria, but so where do you have to go? Is Auckland or Littleton where you would have to go to pick it up and bring it back?
Yes, so we currently have an existing rule in our regional pest management plan for Sabella, which is a Mediterranean fanworm, and we have been working to eradicate that from the top of the south. And this new rule that we've proposed is an additional rule, a level of fouling rule, which is to line up with Marlborough, who already have the rule, so to try and create a top of the south consistency. And that is essentially a risk reduction rule. So trying to, if a boat comes in and they're particularly dirty or have a lot of fouling on their hull, they're more likely to be carrying a pest that we don't want here. And we already have a Sabella specific rule, but this would reduce the risk of other pesty things coming in. And top of the North Island tends to have a lot of those things, and tends to be outside of where the immediate region where we work with. We have a top of the South regional partnership, marine biosecurity partnership, that we work together to try and keep the top of the South clear of pests. And so it's an additional rule to help reduce the risk of those things coming in on heavily fouled boats, without putting that on a local boat that's moored somewhere in the bay, somewhere long term, and might be heavily fouled but isn't actually a pest risk.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, yeah, Councillor Kinnamoth.
Thank you. Through my naivety, can you explain to me how this is going to work in the field? Because some of these organisms are very slow growing. So if I go up to the Bay of Islands with my yacht, come back after a month, what happens then? Do I need my bums cleaned, or do I get lifted out of the water and get a diver to inspect it? Can you just give me a bit of a heads up?
So if you were sailing up there with a really heavily fouled boat, I think you would probably clean it before it came home. So we do have dive inspections currently for Sabella based on our current ruling, and so that we have regular dive surveillance, but we also have other surveillance happening passively as well around. And if you were to leave here and sail up to the Bay of Islands, come home with a really heavily level fouling 3 or more boat, and say you sailed into Nelson Marina, the marina operator there would have requested that you clean, probably. Might need to jump in on exactly how that works, but for Tarakoi, we have a setup where if they're coming in from outside, they are requested to provide evidence that they have cleaned their hull. And at the moment, that we can only enforce that if they have Sabella on the hull, but we would like to be able to enforce it for heavily fouled boats so that we reduce the risk of other pests coming in that we may not have already on our list. Otherwise, we have to individually list all of these pests that may come.
One last question then. Motueka, Port Motueka, do you have the same sort of system there where someone inspects the boats visually when they come back in?
We do periodically dive Port Motueka. It is a slightly less risk just because of the tidal changes there. But we do periodically dive part of our surveillance, but they would be triggered in the same rule.
Okay, Councillor Sanson.
Thanks, through the chair. Gwynnie, you just said something about you'd like at the moment you can require something for Sabella infestation, but you'd like to be able to trigger that if there's heavy fouling. So are you saying that what it's proposed we adopt will trigger that for fouling? So there's not more that's needed. You're comfortable with where it sits?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, great.
Thank you for that report. And I'm aware that there is the, can you just remind me of the name of the group, the Top of the South Marine Biosecurity
Partnership.
Yeah, which is an active group. So,
Correct. It's a group funded through the councils and MPI. So that's Nelson, Tasman, Marlborough and Wellington, and MPI all fund that partnership, but it's a open partnership for anyone who's interested. And so we have active members from the likes of aquaculture and iwi as part of that partnership.
Thank you. So we decided that we're going to now move through to an explanation of the CAT changes. So I think, yeah, it's helpful to just have a rundown. and acknowledging that that it's quite hard to actually get to grips with all this work, because it is under the Biosecurity Act, so it's got to fit into the legislation.
Just finding the right page. So, do you want to talk to Nelson changes? Generally, generally the proposed cat rules, and these are for feral and stray cats. So under the Regional Pest Management Plan, we manage feral and stray cats. We don't manage pet cats. Generally the submissions were really positive in terms of supporting rules, but often either asked for clarification on certain rules or more. Certainly people were keen to see these rules across Tasman and Nelson, but we have recommended not to do that due to the pretty high cost of being able to enforce that sort of widespread rule. So some key changes, if I just run through the attachment 1, is that helpful? Just the key changes as we run through that. Some of these are clarification type changes that we've recommended, and including so for Nelson City, including pest agent cat rules, and Able Tasman we have changed that in response to include the pest agent, a new pest agent cat rule that's similar to St Arnaud, and clarified the St Arnaud rule, and included Bell Island into the Waimea Inlet site-led program. So, do you want to talk to Nelson's changes? Yeah.
So I'll just cover the changes for Nelson that Gwynnie just touched on. Essentially, there's several parts to it. One is really to protect high-value sites from feral cats, and so there's a reporting requirement for anyone who sites feral or potential stray cats and any of the identified sites that are shown on the maps within 48 hours of their sighting. And the other component of it is around sheltering or feeding any feral or stray cats within those sites. So that's to stop the proliferation of feral or strays in those areas. There were some questions around the reporting requirement and what we would do with that information. Essentially, it's really just to sort of highlight that there are potential presence of feral or strays in that particular area. So we would note that and maybe work with local groups to address those. But really, it's alerting us as staff to potential issue in those sites and to discourage fostering of feral or strays in particular. And there's an addition around releasing even companion cats into those sites too. So yeah, that's I guess the no dumping provision.
Just highlight the change in wording. I think the original wording said that you must tell council, and that's been changed to shall. So it lowers that down a little bit, because of course it's very difficult to police a must rule on that sort of thing.
Now, you've got a question about Nelson? Yeah.
Thanks, through the chair. Just on the reporting, the shell report, do you think there's a possibility that we could have some really simple kind of mechanism for reporting? Like I know with, cycle crash or near misses, I think a really simple form on Shape Nelson to do that. I'm just wondering what the thoughts are around what that reporting mechanism might look like, just so that we can be efficient and collect the data. And, you know, if we have it and go through a form or something, and most people use that, particularly all the community conservation groups who are working in those areas, it might kind of automatically populate spreadsheets and stuff. I'm just wondering what thoughts been had around the reporting mechanisms.
Currently, a little thought, but we recognise that there's the app like an Antino app and Shape Nelson, so forms can easily be produced, and then it comes around to education to letting people know that they're available and to use them.
So that would then be potentially communicated out to the adopt a spot groups and Brook Waimarama Sanctuary and all the people involved in kind of trapping and conservation initiatives in those high value areas.
That's right. Just knowing that, of course, we're going through bylaw processes at the same time. So our CAP measures and how we educate the public may go wider than the RPMP and include other provisions. So we would include that all together, hopefully.
Councillor Kinnamoff.
Thank you. I don't know who to address this to, so I'll just say it to the room. So we're going to pass this, presumably pass this bylaw. Where is the cost reflected in some of all this? Is there going to be any fees, anything, any fines?
So just quickly, this is not the bylaw. No, but so we just need to be clear that there is a bylaw, process for bylaw, which Nelson Council are further ahead than we are, but we understand that we are actually also making progress on that. So it's in our minds, it's important to remember that we've got these two processes. One's under government legislation, Biosecurity Act, and the other will be a council, local government bylaw. So, but the intent of your question is.
I can speak to the RPMP funding. So the regional pest to enforce the regional pest management plan, we can't give out fines or anything like that. We basically enforce the rule that we have. So that would be around, yeah, I guess this is a slightly new rule for us, but it is around supporting, we've built them around supporting existing programs that are happening. So Sananad and Able Tasman both have existing cat management programs in the parks and in those surrounding areas, and we've built rules to help support the people that are doing the work already. And so we would step in with biosecurity officers to help enforce a rule, but enforcing a rule, you can only recover the cost of doing that from someone, but you can't hand out a fine.
Councillor Bryant, Deputy Mayor Bryant.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to follow on from partially where Councillor Kinnamoff is, just that at Sananad and around identifying feral cats and domestic or companion pets, call them what you like. Someone's got their pet cat, goes up wandering as they do sometimes. An over enthusiastic person reports it as a feral cat. What happens then? It was like we've got no microchipping or any way of identifying whether it's feral or companion at this stage, have we?
So the rules we have proposed for both Sananad and Able Tasman enclaves have one rule A is that companion cats are identifiable. So similar to the way that we would enforce Waimea Inlet. So try and work that in an education focus. So work with the current cat owners and let them know that these sorts of potential control operations could be happening. We're really clear with people that are, when they catch a cat, they need to be able to identify that it is a feral cat. And so that is why we've brought in rules that requires companion cats in those specific areas be microchipped so they can be identified.
So just to follow on, if I may, Madam Chair, have we communicated that to the community, or we're going to, and are we going to have a lead in time? Because obviously there'll be cats there from 10 plus years old through to new kittens that are companion cats. How are we going to ensure that happens, that people microchip them?
I think we would follow the same way as when you brought in the Waimea Inlet rules. So it's really focusing on their education and lead in, and helping the local groups. So typically those local groups have already been working in this space for a long time. And so then it's not completely new to the local communities that these requirements are coming.
And if I may, I think too, right, like generally you get a feral cat in a cage, I take it they'll be cage type trap animals, so you can pretty much tell by their reaction to if they're going nuts, for want of a better word, or if they're just sitting there purring thinking, well, when's my next feed coming, you can tell. But it's the ones on the fringe of that I'm worried about, and those owners that are not aware that this is happening. So it will need quite a aggressive publicity campaign, particularly in the early days.
Yeah, so the rule we are proposing is around having companion cats identifiable and desexed, and that people don't release their pets into the wild. Those are the rules we'll enforce. And we will work to educate that local community, and as Phil said, around with Nelson, highly likely we'll be looking at bylaw education as well. So it's sort of a wider education practice. Yeah. We're not out to go and find someone's pet.
And I guess in the initial stages, for you, there'll be a bit of temptation and tread softly, if in doubt, let it go type of thing.
Correct, and that's the advice we give now.
Yeah, thank you.
That's a sense of.
Thanks. I think that I thought that there was going to be another presentation from Tasman staff on the Tasman cats, but I think you've kind of done it, haven't you? So I ask you a question now.
Yes, I can I do a slight clarification on one of the rules that we've changed?
And maybe
Just maybe.
Yeah. And Gwynnie, I think what would be really helpful as well is if you could just also talk to us about some of the sites that, because there was a number of sites were proposed for inclusion, and I'd really like some insight from officers as to why those additional sites haven't been included.
Yeah. So for Sinanad rules, we proposed 2 additional rules. So that was not holding a companion cat within that specific Sinanad area unless it's desexed or microchipped. And this rule B was no person shall deliberately release into the wild any companion cat from or living within the mapped area. And we did have a couple of submissions suggesting that rule could be interpreted that you could release a cat from outside of the area. So we have removed the from or living within the mapped area from that rule. So basically you cannot release any cat, including a companion cat, into the wild. And Able Tasman, Peter's just corrected me that we don't have the microchipping rule in for Able Tasman. But we have included the same releasing into the wild rule in Able Tasman. And in addition, we had a submission requesting that we extend the Waimea Estuary site-led program, and we hadn't originally proposed any changes to that program. And so what we've recommended to do is to include Bell Island. So there were a number of sites around the Waimea Inlet that was requested to extend that site-led program into, and Bell Island is council land. There's no there's nobody living out there, so we don't think that would have any kind of detriment to existing landowners out there having that rule. So it makes sense that we can be able to introduce that to Bell Island. But the other sites were either included private land or were right next to private land, and we haven't gone out and consulted with those affected landowners, so we would recommend not including those just because we don't feel like we've sufficiently consulted with people who would be directly affected by those rules.
So I think like the consideration of broader areas across Tasman did come up when the scope of this was being considered, and my understanding was that the consultation process was actually the mechanism to hear from the community about other areas. And I'm just noting there's like a submission from Tasman Environmental Trust about the farmers for FEO areas. You know, and I wonder, you know, is it really like, is there just no way that some of these other areas can be considered for inclusion at this stage? And there's a number of areas in Golden Bay as well, Taupata, Walk-on Wood. I mean, I know, I understand the need to have it, I guess, constrained and areas where there are active, let's say, conservation groups. So, you know, it could be the farmers catchment group who are doing the trapping and planting and that kind of thing. Yeah, I guess I'm just concerned that the next review, you know, if it's years away, that's a lot of impact on our native flora and fauna, but particularly obviously fauna, when we are in a, you know, kind of state of biodiversity collapse. So just, you know, want to make sure that we are really considering these other areas. So
so similar concern that we have around those additional sites for the Waimea Inlet is that because they weren't initially proposed in our original proposal that went out for public consultation, those landowners who would be directly affected, and particularly the sites in Golden Bay, really affects a lot of people along that coastline, that we would then recommend that you would need to go out for a second round of consultation to include those sites back into the regional pest management plan, which is an option, but we wouldn't recommend that at this stage. At the same time, the bylaw, a lot of the rules that we would be looking to bring in for those sites, those two specific sites, would be similar rules to what the bylaw process is bringing in. And so we think you may be just bringing in additional rules that may not have the impact that you really are looking for if in addition to into a bylaw rule. And so we've taken note of those sites, so definitely to be able to do a lot of a bit more investigation into those sites. We did go back to the submitters and ask if they had done any kind of talking to those landowners and got them on board, and it was a bit mixed. And so, yeah, we just don't feel confident that you can put rules on people without having the chance for them to be to give submissions in response.
So yeah, so in practicality, if in the future a bylaw is adopted that requires microchipping, for example, the groups that are already working in those areas will have some mechanism for being able to identify cats, and if they're already working in those areas, they will be able to control for cats, provided they are clearly ensuring it's not a companion.
Correct.
Yeah. And then can you just remind me when is this going to go out for like full review again? So at what point can it be considered for, you know, more broadly across Tasman like we have in Nelson?
The current RPMP is to 2029, so we would probably start considering review 2027 would be my guess.
So then can I just ask that all of the areas that have been identified by submitters, I know you did say that, but I may not be around the table then, so that they are really, that we make concerted effort to go out and do pre-engagement with all of those communities. And I guess also any other areas across Nelson that could be considered as well. I'm thinking Cable Bay, Hera, just, yeah, thanks.
So, yep, I've just got one question. Councillor Stour's got a question too, but I just to, because there is a requirement under the Act that there is a positive cost benefit analysis, isn't there? And that, would you say that that's really driving actually what we decide to do as well? I don't want a sort of full explanation. I just wanted to ask that whether that is a kind of foundation process that drives what we decide to do here.
Correct. Jim is on, James is online if you want a detailed description of a cost benefit analysis for this particular piece of work, because he had completed all of that. But yes, the cost benefit analysis is the foundation where we decide whether it's worth bringing in as a pest rule. So Councillor Stallard.
Thanks. I do have a question, but first, Councillor Sampson's comment about Tasman Environmental Trust make a submission reminded me I should notify potential conflict of interest, and that I'm in the process of joining that board. So I have attended one meeting. I haven't been formally admitted to the board. I haven't held discussions with that group about their submission and so on. It's probably worth tabling.
Well, thanks for noting that. Yeah, we've noted that.
Okay, the question is around the rules around no person shall deliberately release into the wild a cat. And then for each of those sites, there is wording when it says the wild, it qualifies it to the site. Does that mean there are currently no rules around outside of this pest management plan that say you shouldn't release the cat to the wild?
Correct, yes.
There are rules under Wildlife Welfare Acts outside of a council that you should look after your companion animals, and by dumping them is contrary to that. So there are rules, but they're far away.
Yeah, Councillor Bench.
Thank you. So if I live on the edge of the Waimea Estuary or Abel Tasman or St Arnaud, then I've got 5 cats and you catch all of them every week. How many weeks do you keep doing that? Is there no consequence? Because if there isn't, we haven't achieved anything.
I have to think about this now.
It's well within the realms of reality.
Correct. I think we would be the rule that we would be insisting on in that sense, that you would be catching the cat that is not microchipped or desexed, is the rule that you would be leaning on. Catching someone's pet cats over and over again doesn't break a rule, and if they're their pet cats, they have the right to roam around, as long as they are desexed and microchipped in those in the St Arnaud area.
Okay.
Madam Chair, if I can just add to that, as much as anything in this, the rules around cats are to up or elevate the profile. The rules for Abel Tasman especially relate to a site-led program, which there's about another 8 or 9 pests in that section. So we're just adding cats to that. So I understand what the point you're saying. It's mostly about promoting the fact that, you know, cats, feral or stray cats, are not wanted, and it only applies to those enclaves, specific enclaves noted in the plan. It's not for landowners all round Abel Tasman. It's in relation to those 5 sites only.
Right. Yep, councillor Kinnamoth.
Oh, that's a big call. So this doesn't stop someone taking their cat to Rabbit Island and dumping it there, because it's not a high biodiversity site, so they can dump it still at Rabbit Island. Look forward to 2027.
Yeah, so we've had a request for a 5-minute break. And that's fine. Yep, I'm okay with that till 10:15. If anybody wants to get a quick drink or something, 5 minutes, because it is quite intense, this business. Yep. Yep, well, then we'll go on to Pines. So before we move on to the pine conifer issue, Rob Smith is just going to clarify how the legislation works down at the ground, which I think is what people are asking about. For the Nelson.
Kia ora, through the chairs. So at the moment I'm acting GM for Information Science and Technology. So the biosecurity teams fit within that group. So as far as the legislation goes, when we're looking at this process that we're going through at the moment, this is so we're essentially on a pathway to get improved cat management. So that's improved welfare as well as good predator control. So in the absence of national legislation, because remember the country has been asking for national legislation that should be very similar to dogs or some form like that, and that has been discussed for quite some time, but it's not in place. So the rules that we have available to ourselves are like using the Biosecurity Act through the Regional Pest Management Plan, which you're doing here today, and the ability to enact a bylaw. So, which is also what we're doing, and the bylaw and the Regional Pest Management Plan will go hand in hand, that they'll work together to improve that management. So at the moment, if you think about today with the cats, we're enabling those groups working in this space to do their job, which they do very well, and we're really pleased they're doing it, without the it's part of that hand in hand with the community to get better cat management. And at the moment, we don't have the rules in place that says it's inappropriate to have cats dumped here, or it's inappropriate to feed a colony of cats here. So we actually want that ability for those groups to operate. What will come in beside this is the bylaw, which both councils are working on at the moment, which has that requirement around identification, which is via the microchipping and possibly desexing. So once the bylaw requires the microchipping, then when the community group acting under the Regional Pest Management Plan is operating, they've got a really clear indication the cat is not microchipped, it's behaving like a feral animal. We can operate ethically in that space. So at the moment, it's a little bit hard for the groups to operate. And the reason why it has been working so well around the Waimea estuary is because we put a lot of work into there. Those owners have identified their cats, they have the photo record, and they have the microchipping. That's a huge ask to do at a regional scale. So at the regional scale, we need to empower people to be able to operate. there are other obligations on the cat owner themselves. They still have the Animal Welfare Act that they have to comply with. You know, you have to look after your animal. It is a living sentient being. And we also have the Wildlife Act that Phil mentioned, that you know, you're not allowed to disrupt those wildlife. So there are other powers, but we don't operate those. They're other people, and in reality, they're not particularly effective at managing this situation. So when we're thinking about this, think about that we're on a path, we're improving management. It is a learning opportunity for us and the community, and for the next few years, the operation of these new rules will be essentially reported against, so that when we come back in 2029 to redo the regional pest management plan, we can learn on that as well. So we will get better. This is our first step. And it's a little bit like when you're about to talk about the pines as well. This is not the end game for solving wildings. This is starting on that path. So we bring everybody together with us, and we actually do this well. So it's much more of a partnership with our community. And in this case, for cats, it's a partnership with cat owners. They'll identify them, we can manage them effectively, and people don't have to second guess all the time, because that's what's happening at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that. I think now, are you happy to move on to to pines now? Thanks, Gwen.
I'll just introduce the pest conifer rules, but I'm going to ask Peter Russell to run through these, as he knows them inside out and back to front. So he's definitely the best one to run you through the changes. So we proposed 5 pest conifer and wilding conifer rules at the time, and we did receive a number of really good submissions, actually, and really helpful submissions, and has resulted in a number of changes, and some of them will just require you to step through each individual rule change and explain those as we go. Might be helpful to do a general overview of what the feedback we got, and then rule by rule. That might be helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, so the issue of pest and wilding conifers obviously got the biggest number of issues and feedback from the submitters. So just a couple of things to introduce the subject. So as Rob mentioned, you know, this is a journey to a start of a getting more sensible and practical management for pest and wilding conifers. So Tasman and Nelson are the only region that have got a national program happening within it that haven't got a regional pest management plan sort of backup rules. So it's bringing this region or the 2 regions into line nationally with regional pest management requirements. So there's a lot of alignment happening with Marlborough and the ECAN programs where they've got wilding conifers. So I guess, look, the 2 major objectives for why the inclusion of pest and wilding conifers in the region is, one is to stop the spread of these things happening to places where it hasn't got to. That is just a no-brainer, really. We don't want more of the same issues coming up, so that's one of the main threads. And the second one is with the inclusion of radiata pine and Douglas fir in particular as wilding species, there is an onus on the forestry industry to address the spread that is possible to come from these sites. So that's there's no way we want to stop commercial forestry happening in the regions. It's about landowners, being responsible for the obligations to stop spreading pests. So that's I guess they're the foundation stones for why we've included the pest and wilding conifers. So just by way of going through, I guess, from the start. So just to clarify, so we've split, as Marlborough have, the pest conifers into 2 categories. So there's a group of 10 conifers which are nationally nasty. No one wants to see them. They have basically no commercial worth, and we've deemed those to be pest conifers, and that's the main subject of the program. There are those 2 species which are commercial species, radiata pine and Douglas fir. So they fit into like a subcategory in terms of definitions under this wider program. So where they occur in a wildling self-seeded state, they are deemed to be a pest. So that was the first big change we did, was to the definition. It's not changing it too much. It's just bringing in the wilding species as a subgroup of the pest conifers, if you like. So the focus is on, we want to get that term out there. These are pest conifers that we're dealing with in the main. The second big change we had was the impacts on regional values. So a number of submitters didn't think the wording we had was sufficient to address the regional impacts. So that's been changed now to include specific economic and environmental effects that are happening in this region, like the effects of wilding spread into the Dun Mountain area and the Red Hills. So we've put some specific description around those factors. They are real impacts that are happening now. Similarly with impacts in water catchment areas. So there's a lot more delving into the impacts through that a national report, the Superior Report for wilding conifers nationally around cost and benefit stuff. So we've applied more of that information to this region as to why they've been included and the rationale for inclusion. I mean, yeah, going back to the original rationale for the inclusion of these species is to protect the investment that's been made currently in the region. So that's the 4 operational areas that are funded or part funded through the national program. So they haven't changed. We had some issues in the submissions around mapping and the determination of mapping, and that is very difficult to do at a region-wide scale. So what we've suggested is that in terms of mapping, when a complaint is made, we go into, or the staff will go into in-depth analysis or mapping of the particular site in question, rather than trying to address the mapping in the RPMP. These are just generalist maps. So there's a lot of submissions and issues around maps. And while it was helpful, I think the best way to approach it is on a case-by-case basis. And the maps indicated here are just that, an indication. So we've addressed those issues. I guess the main changes come about with the rules. So we've still got 5 rules that we're proposing. So there's 3 that apply nationally, regionally, and 2 that apply just to the operational areas. So going through those, they have had significant tweaks, I guess, if you like, but the intent still has stayed the same. So if we go through, would you like to go through rule by rule? Is that a good way to do it? So the first rule is about a clear land rule. So this is what I said at the start was, we don't want to stop. We want to stop the spread of wilding pines to areas that are currently free of them. That is kind of a non-negotiable, just makes sense to do that. So the original intent of the rule we had when it went out to the public was it was about protecting places which had yet to be identified. So submitters quite rightly wanted some more detail around that. They weren't happy that these sites weren't nailed down and that there was a process as yet undetermined to go through. So we've thought about that and come back to focusing on just areas. It's more of a general requirement to control wilding conifers unless the land falls in a named operational area or it's an urban area or high intensity land use area. So it's kind of flipped it on its head. It's a general rule, that a general requirement for landowners to control those pests outside of urban and high use areas, unless there's a negotiated agreement in place between the occupier and an agency to negate that. So it's less about protecting sites, because that's going down the site-led program, which starts to get a bit like the cats There's more to it than just than that. And we hadn't actually identified any of the sites. It was allegedly headlands, high biodiversity areas, but hadn't been mapped. So I think this approach makes it more, it goes back to the original intent, I think, that MPI envisaged when they wanted this rule brought in. And it hasn't been picked up by many regions at all, this keeping area that's free of pests, wilding pest free. So that's a very good step in my mind. So we've tightened up the rules around what reasonable steps are.
Sorry, just Peter, I'm just wondering about questions. So have you finished on the first rule? Yeah, so maybe we could allow for questions on that particular rule so that we are all clear about where we're going.
Thanks, through the chair. Thanks, Peter. I've just got a really quick question around this. So the intent is that there's a general rule requiring the control of pest conifers or wilding conifers. I'm just curious as to why urban areas it's not a requirement in urban areas. I'm just aware, you know, there are urban areas that are in the proximity of, say, high value, you know, areas of high ecological value, and so I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, that's a good question. To my mind, it's about, you know, your traditional urban area like Richmond or Nelson City, the actual physical hard urban area. There's less likely to be pine trees growing there. We'd have to possibly map those areas just to make sure there's no issues around those fringe areas and where the lifestyle blocks fit in. But it's meant to be the, you know, asphalt paved housed urban areas is what is meant by that.
Okay, so I'm thinking of Nelson, for example, where we've got you know, hills that are in proximity of the coastal environment, and you know, the Wakapuaka kind of wetland area. Is there a need to specify not the urban area? Like, I'm just wondering, could you not just have the general rule that applies across the region?
Yes, I guess you could. It was really just an intent to kind of narrow down. So the submitters wanted more definition rather than just too much regional approach to it, I guess. So yeah, we didn't name sites originally because we hadn't gone down through that process, but we tried to flip it to say it was excluded operational areas currently. The acknowledged urban areas, which I guess they are mapped, they are through the district plan, and any areas of high intensity. So they seem to be the catch-all areas. They'd be less likely to have pest conifer issues in them compared to the urban, the rural areas.
Thank you. Or Councillor Stoward.
Thanks, Chair Butler. Just following up on Councillor Sanson's questions, you seem to indicate that urban areas, they are less likely to have pest, I guess, conifers generate there. But what about being a seed area? Like, are we saying these are actually pest conifers, but you can plant them in your backyard? We just don't want them sort of outside of urban areas. But is there potential that there will be a problem? Because I just think of Nelson, we've got many people living very close to nature reserves. So firstly, what is the intention? Is it just saying we don't think the spread to those areas will be a problem? But have we considered whether those urban areas will be a source problem?
Well, I think, Madam Chair, when you look at the species, the 10 species on that list, they're very, very unlikely to be, people would know what they were particularly and available to be planted. Yeah, most of them they're banned from sale and propagation, so you can't buy them nationally, and they just aren't around. So it's, you know, no one's going to go out and probably plant a Scots pine because they think it looks good in their garden. I just think it's unlikely.
So just to follow up on that. This is really, I mean, we have to have some pragmatism here. And, you know, that's really, we have to put a limit in somewhere from a pragmatic point of view for what's doable and remembering the cost benefit analysis requirement.
Thanks. If I could just have another question. Thank you. So the line preceding the rules finishes with prior to cone bearing. So it suggests those rules require actions on trees prior to cone bearing. So what about the case of pest conifers are of cone bearing age? How do the rules handle those trees?
That's a very good question. So do you mean if an inspection's carried out and they've found they're already at cone bearing? Well, I get my approach would be that the rules already been triggered, if you like, and that would be treated the same way as ideally they should be controlled before cone bearing, but practicalities and realities happen. If people come along and find they're already at cone bearing age, that makes it even more imperative to get on top of them.
I guess my question is, would this, in a legal sense, give the occupier a way out of the rule by saying, I only have to apply rule A prior to cone bearing, it's past, it is cone bearing, I no longer have to destroy the pest conifers?
Yes, I guess. Look, I don't know the answer to that. It'd be a technical question, but the whole intent is around trying to stop them before the cone bearing. If they already are cone bearing, then that, to me, indicates the rules well and truly triggered and they're on that path to getting rid of them.
So would it be safer just to remove those last 5 words prior to cone bearing? I mean, how would that affect things?
Once that has a cone on it, then it's creating more of a problem, it's exacerbating. So we need those plants gone before they're cone bearing. So I wouldn't want to allow them to grow and then produce seed before they get taken out. So by removing the prior to cone bearing, you allow us to not control a tree until it's 30, 40 years old, potentially. So the where our brains are is potentially that all the trees have gone and we're dealing with the trees that are coming up afterwards. And before they become a cone bearing, which is, becoming a problem, we get rid of them. So I see the problem that you've highlighted there is that what happens to those trees that are already there and coning? And perhaps we need to take legal direction on the wording there.
Yeah, I would like that to be covered. I would want that to be, I would like to be reassured that the rules deal with trees that are already cone bearing. And I'll leave it to staff to sort that out, in your opinion. It just seems it's a potential loophole to me at this stage.
Okay, thank you. So that may affect the resolution as it stands, unless this can be dealt with within the actual resolution that exists.
If I may just clarify, Madam Chair, these rules have pretty much piggybacked on all the other regional councils' rules. Every other council in the South Island's got similar rules, and the MPI guidance specifically had these words in there. So I understand the issue being raised, but in the interest of keeping, it compatible across all the councils, I'd advise keeping that wording in for that consistency.
Thank you. Consistency is the word there. Councillor Benj.
Thank you. The difference between Pinus radiata and Douglas, you've set that aside. I just want to, this is a scenario which I see playing out in front of me. So Douglas fir tended to be planted in plantations with pines, a block of Douglas fir, block of pines, so forth. So if you cut down the pines and the Douglas fir come up amongst the new pines that are planted, are they the wrong tree in the wrong place, or are they, what I see is this: a Douglas plantation beside a pine plantation, and you can already see young Douglas coming up in the pine plantation, and it's probably 15 years from being cut down. When that's cut down, probably that whole face will come up with Douglas, because that, you know, they're on the top edge of it. They'll be cone bearing as well, and you know, maybe that's okay. You plant pines back on it, and they will probably beat the Douglas, but they will actually still be there. And the next time they cut down in 25 years' time, there will be Douglas amongst them, possibly cone bearing, and maybe the entire block then becomes Douglas or has an infestation. And what's beside that block might be anything. Could be, you know, reserve, national park, whatever. It's so that there's a Douglas fir in a pine plantation in the wrong place. Was it just okay?
So first and foremost, Madam Chair, these rules do not apply to any plantation forestry over 1 hectare in size. That is the definition of exclusion.
Yep.
So if it's Douglas fir within a planted area over 1 hectare, then the rules don't apply to this, and that's outside of the whole pest management plan situation.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think maybe we go on to the next rule. Thank you.
Right, so rule B is this is about the plantation forestry spread rule. So again, this rule is looking at reducing the likelihood of wilding spread onto neighbouring property and impacting on their economic livelihood, whatever it might be. So it's got a pretty high bar to cross. So first of all, the neighbour has to be actively doing their wilding conifer control. Secondly, there has to be some clear spread occurring from the plantation forestry onto that private land. And the change we made, I guess, so there's the landowner has to be taking reasonable steps. So we've outlined what that means, and that means they're doing control that's advocated for through best practice and using the methods and tools advocated by the national program. And the evidence of spread, there's no hard and fast rule, but there's guidance here around evidence of spread being they have to be the same species as those in the forest plantation. Here's my scroll down there. Yep, that the source forestry trees were cone bearing as of 1st of July. So that July 1 date this year was chosen, I guess arbitrarily. It reflects the time frame of when this process was being enacted. So there's no other reason other than that. There's no other likely seed sources located nearby. So there is some more. Again, the submitters wanted some surety around where this rule would be would kick in. The main submission point, the main sticking point from the forestry consortium was around when this would kick in. So they didn't want to be responsible for legacy plantings, that legacy spread going on to neighbouring property. So it's only spread that can be traced back to 1 July this year that would impact on their responsibilities to be liable for wilding spread onto a neighbouring property. So they came up with that rule themselves. We looked at that and thought, yep, that's reasonable. It means that possibly there's a wait period until any of those seedlings did pop up before that rule could be activated. which is, I guess, is fine. Again, it's signalling that approach, as Rob said, we're on that path to doing more and better sensible management around stopping that wilding spread. There are plenty of areas that I can think of where there's been no management of wilding, of pine tree plantations, and that wilding spread has occurred out onto neighbouring property. So this is an attempt to stop that happening and bring in some sensible rules, but there are some high bars to cross as well. Yeah, so basically this is the forestry submitters weren't overly keen on this rule to start with, but they actually came up with their own solution, which we think is workable.
Questions now?
Oh, it doesn't matter.
Okay. That's it. You want- yeah, you go.
Okay. What happened to the 200-metre rule? That's still in there? So the forestry owners were against that for a start. And also around this table, they mentioned how through DNA testing, they could not prove that the one species was in the forest, one was out. And so I thought that we were going to drop that idea. And lastly, it sounds like you talked back to the submitters and they're very happy with what you've put into this rule.
Yep, through you, Madam Chair, the 200-metre rule still is there, so it still impacts. It's got to be within that 200-metre boundary. It's not for the whole adjoining property. So that hasn't changed. The other part about the genetics side of things, look, I think we've done a whole lot of work around wilding conifer work around the country, and it's just impossible to try and trace genetic. A lot of them originate from the same genetic strand, so you can't tell whether one tree came from one part of a forest or another. It's just impossible at this stage, as I understand, as I've been told by the Scion scientists.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So just in relation to the 200-metre rule, a company like 141 potentially got a huge boundary, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong. They just have to cover the cost of the adjoining landowner clearing it if it's a problem for 200 metres from the boundary. And it's up to the adjoining owner to raise the issue and through, and that's where I'm a little, do they go direct to the company or come to us?
Yes, it is up to the adjoining landowner to instigate the complaint. Ideally, they should be talking to their neighbours first and try and arrange a satisfactory outcome outside of the whole RPMP process. That would be the ideal. If that can't be achieved, then they would certainly approach the council. And we want to also make sure that a negotiated agreement with the two parties is always better than having to go down the enforcement process. The rule is a fallback position, I guess, if the parties can't come to any agreement or there's an impasse, that rule's there. But in my experience, most cases like this can be solved through sitting down, talking about the issues on a case by case. But the RPMP needs to have a backstop, and that's what this rule is.
And Peter, most of the companies now supportive of this, because at the hearings they did raise some concerns.
Right.
We
Right.
have taken the rule that they proposed during the hearings. That is the rule that we have in the wording we have now in Rule B. So we've taken their requested changes, but we haven't directly taken that back to them.
Well, if they proposed it, one would think they supported it, wouldn't you? They do.
The main change, Madam Chair, was that started Rule B was from 1 July, occupiers would be liable, and that's basically all that's changed. They didn't want that legacy hanging over them. There's anything from now on, they were prepared to run with, given that it's going to take some time to show up any issues.
Yeah, just through the chair, if that's okay. Just to clarify, remember that the landowner impacted upon needs to be active in managing their own land as well. So you can't ignore your own problems and then try and get the neighbour to do something. So it's a lot like gorse or the other boundary control issues.
Would that apply if the adjoining land was stock as well? Because I'm thinking of like the up near Gordon's Knob, that type of area through there.
Sorry, we have an additional rule that we will come to, Rule D, that binds the Crown, but the Crown is not bound by this particular rule.
Thank you.
Who's okay? All right, you go then.
Thanks through the chair. I think, yeah. So, I've got a couple of questions on this role. And I guess, the first one is the authorised person, so that's a council, someone from council, I'm assuming.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
And so the idea of, is that, a landowner can approach council if they're already managing wildings on their property, they can approach council and there will be a pretty straightforward and supportive process for council to support that landowner in negotiations with a plantation owner. Is that correct? Because I can just imagine, there's quite a significant power imbalance if you're, a small landholder versus a massive plantation owner. And
yes, sure. Yeah, and look, that is the role of Winnie and her staff to play that role of intermediary, working with the parties to get some practical outcomes sorted. So there's requirements around what an authorised person means, and they have to act with fairness and all that sort of stuff. So it's no different to any other rule, whether it's gorse or rabbits or broom. It should be the same approach.
So will it be really well communicated, across the region, like as part of this, that is an option for landowners who are actively trying to manage wildings on their property, that basically council can support them in this process and in conversations with neighbours?
Yes. So we have, in response to this, been working on getting a bit more clarity, particularly on our websites and things of how these processes work, how our enforcement processes work, and where biosecurity officers can come in and help support neighbouring landowners to work through these rules. And as Rob mentioned, the gorse and broom and those sorts of things we already have in our rules, we already do, and so it'll be the same process that we operate under.
So I've got two more questions and they're important, so I'll just
all right, just two.
Yep. Oh, but they might take a little bit of time, and it's, this is really important. This is a rule that's been introduced by the forestry industry, so we need to really understand this and make sure that we're comfortable with it, given that 78% of the submissions were in support of the original rules that we had. So my next question is, at the very last bullet point, the evidence of spread includes, but is not limited to. So the last bullet point, it says, is there are no other likely seed sources located on the adjoining land or other neighbouring land. So I can imagine a situation where we've got a landowner and they have a neighbour. So this rule, the neighbour, which is a, plantation forest, has a requirement or responsibility for the 200 metres. But this landowner might have, let's say, if it's a big area, a big farm, a kilometre away, there could be another plantation forest. And in that case, it would be adjoining land or neighbouring land that is a seed source. So it's kind of a loophole for the neighbour within 200 metres to actually get out of the responsibility. So I'm wondering with that final bullet point, if we should actually be applying the 200-metre rule both ways. So if you've got an area 200 metres to the neighbour, which is a plantation forest, surely you should only be looking at a seed source another 200 metres as being culpable for that area. And provided there isn't a seed source within 200 metres of that strip, then the responsibility lies with the neighbouring plantation forest. Because the way it's written, I feel like there's no culpability for the, or no onus, or no responsibility for the plantation forest if way down the other end of a farm there might be another forestry block that's a neighbouring or adjoining land. So how do we kind of deal with that inconsistency and the loophole that is potentially there? Could we amend this to say there are no other likely seed sources located on the adjoining land or other neighbouring land within 200 metres?
I might have to unpick your question a little bit, sorry. Just to
Does it make
understand. Yeah, so the purpose of putting this particular bullet point is to ensure that the landowner who has raised the complaint doesn't have a seed source tree on their own property, so that and we do have specific examples of this here that forestry companies raised, that they have been trying to work with landowners voluntarily, but the landowner has a large seeding tree on their own property that they could argue is actually the cause of the spread. And so what we are basically asking the landowner who is complaining that they are getting wilding spread onto their property, that their own land, so that is the land that we're referring to as adjoining land, their own property is clear of seeding trees, so that they are not the problem, and then are just putting the blame onto their neighbouring plantation forest when actually they are also have a source tree on their own property. So that may require a slight reword to be clear that it's the property owner that's complaining must have the clear, not have the seed source, not necessarily that the next neighbour down the road has the seed source in terms of what we're referring to as adjoining land. So I'm not sure if there's a...
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, no, it's so that makes, now that you've made that point, that makes it clear. But the way I read it, it reads that, let's say I'm a farm, I've got a forestry plantation here, and then I've got another one way down there. This one could say, well, we're not responsible because you've got another one at the other end. So I think we have to be really clear that it's the it's the occupied land that, needs to be clear.
Just the complainants,
Yes.
basically, isn't it?
Yeah.
They have to have their house in order.
Yeah.
Basically, before they can make a valid complaint.
So is that possible, before we pass this today, to have a look at that wording? Because I don't feel comfortable with it as it is.
We can amend that in the resolution. So
we don't have to do it on the fly. Hopefully we'll have a yeah. And then I think one other thing, and this probably is going to go to Councillor Stallard's question. So I can, let's say I've got a farm and this rule comes in and I'm like, great, chop down all of the wilding pines that are on my property, a few because there aren't many, but I chop them down. So I've got no seed source. And then in this 200-metre strip, some start to appear. Will this neighbouring forestry plantation be liable for those, even if I have had cone-bearing pines present, say, yesterday, but they're not there today because I chopped them down and they're gone. So I've done my, I've cleared my land, my house is in order. If wildings start to appear in this 200 strip, will it be the forestry plantation's responsibility or not?
Yes, but we probably wouldn't be pushing to enforce it the next day.
No, but I'm just getting
true. But you've described exactly the situation we would like to see. So if a landowner thinks, I think these trees are a problem, they're coming onto my land, they would take every effort to clear their own property. They may contact us, or hopefully they would just talk to their neighbouring forestry owner and say, hey, this is what I'm doing, and by the way, do you know about the rule? And have a bit of evidence that they've made that effort and cleared the land, and then anything popping up after that effort would then, within that 200-metre boundary, would be the responsibility of the plantation.
So there's no possibility that the plantation owner could say, well, 5 years ago you had a cone bearing wilding, there. So these trees might be from that. So we're not going to deal with it. That's not a possibility at all.
Is the rule, as I would interpret the rule that we've put in, and that's part of the reason they've asked for that 30th of June date cutoff, that gives the forestry owners a little bit of a leeway in that sense that you couldn't claim that the complaining landowner couldn't complain tomorrow, for example, on that, but it would be pretty clear if there is a bit of a risk that potentially that's where the original seed source came from 5 years ago, but pine seed isn't particularly long lived.
Yeah. So the intention.
I'm just going to.
Just through the chair, remember part of the to become an authorised person, we actually, all our staff are trained, and there's a whole procedure around it. So it's a well recognised process, and part of that is being reasonable. So one of the officer going on site will take those things into account. So clearly, if there's still if there's windrows of pine trees present, they're not going to say, oh, absolutely, it's the neighbour's fault. So they will take that into account. Remember, we have aerial photography, so we know what was there 5 years ago. So part of being a reasonable officer will be taking that into account. So it won't be their job to be draconian. And it does give the neighbouring landowner absolutely the right to say, I challenge you to show that this is the case. And of course, as time goes on, it becomes a much stronger case to say it's coming from the neighbour. So yeah, as Gwynnie says, our officers won't jump in tomorrow and start enforcing unreasonable rules.
That's really helpful. Thanks.
Thank you.
So just to add to that, Madam Chair, the viability of Douglas fir seed and radiata seed is quite low, like in terms of years, like compared to gorse, which can have a 20-year seed bank. Pine trees are a lot less in that seed bank situation.
Thank you.
Yes. Thanks, Chair Butler. In the case that next month a landowner has wildings extending on their property, they extend 500 metres from an adjacent plantation forest, and they haven't done anything to them, what happens from there?
Well, the rule wouldn't get triggered because A, they haven't done any control work, they haven't met their side of the bargain, and their complaint would be judged to be invalid, I would guess, in that situation.
So the landowner would first have to clear the wildings further than 200 metres from the plantation and then make a complaint. Is that the way it would work?
Yes, and I think if we had a phone call come in asking, we would go and talk that through with that landowner and help them get the clear land we would have that negotiated agreement, I guess, is that you would say that you need to be showing that you've cleared your land, made all of the effort to clear your land of wildings, and then get a bit of evidence for that, photos, and we can help get that guidance, and then from then it would be clear that the wildings that then pop up after they've made all of that effort is coming from the plantation neighbour.
Yeah, I think my understanding is that the Rule B that went out consultation covered legacy pines, and the revised version doesn't. And I think that opens up a whole set of new problems for me. I think it means that for Rule B to be enacted, landowners have to go pay themselves to clear all legacy pines outside of that 200-metre barrier. So until they do that, potentially inside, although I think the wording says they must be actively controlling elsewhere. Is that the case? So they don't have to be actively controlling within 200 metres, but they do elsewhere. So there's a big upfront bill to gain the benefit of the new rule. Given that 100% of the problem sort of wilding pines today are legacy pines, that every single one of them, this rule doesn't address that problem, if my understanding is correct. So that's left as a problem. It addresses preventing the problem within 200 metres of plantation in the future. So really, I think we started out saying it's going to take care of legacy within 200 metres, and now it's not. So that discussion still needs to be had, and I wonder if there's scope for saying there should be shared cost in the case that the landowner hasn't been actively managing them in the past, whether there is a solution, because until we deal with the legacy, it's very difficult to deal with what's going forward.
Yeah, through the chair, if I could answer that. So remember, this is a rule going forward, but this is about looking forward as we start to improve practice. It would be a really big ask to go back and because remember, most of these companies have changed hands several times, to go back and put an obligation on someone who may not have been the cause of that. But for a landowner to be dealing with a legacy issue, they've watched that legacy issue for the last 5, 10, 15, 30 years develop. So it would be unreasonable for them to come back in now and say, oh, I've ignored it for 30 years, it's now the neighbour's problem. That's not reasonable. So what's reasonable is that landowner goes and clears their problem. And remember, active farmers are already clearing their own problems. So they would clear, so they start with a clean slate. Then if the neighbour is causing a problem, so they're having spread, it will be the neighbour's problem. So we can't force a lack of action by a present landowner on the neighbour who didn't cause that problem. So they've watched this develop. And it sounds a hard thing to say, but you can't suddenly wake up tomorrow and say, oh, this is now a problem for me when I've watched it for the last 20, 30 years. So we have to be reasonable to all parties, including the neighbour. So you've cleared your land right back to the boundary. The neighbours start spreading seeds onto your land, then they'll become responsible. That's also the reason for that cone-bearing age, is that we're actually trying to get this. So we're clean slating, and then we're trying to get on top of this before it becomes a continuing legacy. So we on the pathway to better practice, we have to put a line in the sand somewhere, and we're saying the line is now. It's just too hard to go back.
Thanks. I have a few more questions and just some more thoughts on that. I'm not sure what the process is, but I'm keen to explore this further, because I see that the rule is severely hamstrung by the fact we're not addressing legacy pines. And all parties have watched them develop, the pines grow. Anyway, I just wonder about the wording in Rule B, forest plantation properties boundary. And I know we can define this, and there might be a property and the plantation might go right up to the edge, or it might not. So is this deliberate that we want the boundary of the property, or do we want the boundary of the plantation?
So are you saying that is this situations where the trees aren't planted right up to the boundary of the forestry block? They may be offset by several hundred metres, for example?
Oh, that's right. I just wanted to be clear. We want to talk about the boundary of the property, or do we really want to talk about the boundary of the plantation trees?
Hmm.
I guess it has to be the property, otherwise there wouldn't be a problem.
The property has to be the sure.
Got another question?
Yes. Step 4 in terms of negotiating agreements and so on. If there's no agreement, Regional Pest Management Plan enforcement provisions then apply. What does that mean?
Right, so they're the general enforcement provisions which are enacted by the council, and every council essentially has the same process. So it's going through a informal program to achieve agreement. That's what the negotiation plan is in place. If all those discussions fall through, then there are legal sections in the Biosecurity Act which can be brought in, like section 122 is a notice of direction which formally directs a landowner to do something in relation to that land. And step 3 is either a prosecution or the council can enact work. So when it gets to either of the step 2 or step 3, that's pretty, getting into pretty serious territory. And by all means, all parties would want to achieve that buy-in that step 1.
In the different rules, is that fine, or should it be consistent? Does it? I think between, for example, B and C, one is undertaking proactive wild conifer control, and the other is taking reasonable steps to control pest conifers.
No, that's a good question. It should be consistent, I believe. So the reasonable steps is the terminology that's used first up in that rule B. So that should apply throughout in terms of where landowners actively doing work.
I'll leave that to staff if we want to accommodate that in some way. Finally, there is an intention for staff to look again at that wording of bullet point 3 on evidence of spread to clarify that it is just between the adjacent land or the landowner and the plantation rather than land adjacent to the landowner. I do wonder if I would ask staff to also consider a different version for us to consider that does mention the 200-metre rule, because otherwise, for any landowner to enact the rule, they cannot have any Douglas fir or pine on their property that they might be growing for the purpose of firewood or something. Until they get rid of all of them, they cannot enact the rule. So to me, it makes more sense to say no other likely seed sources within 200 metres. Because if you've got a case of a farm with one pine somewhere and then 10,000 pines in plantation owner says, well, look at this guideline, your one plant is a likely seed source, we're not going to take responsibility. Is there a risk of that happening? In which case, I would really prefer the 200-metre rule applied to this as well as for the plantation owner.
Look, I get what you're saying, councillor. I mean, to my mind, this comes down to, again, in the opinion of the authorised person, and it's hard to think of cases on the fly, because they'd all be approached on a case-by-case basis. The general intent, it's not limited to just those 3 bullet points. There may be other issues that come up relevant and pertinent to that side only, but the intent we talked about before was people need to have their own house in order, and that's kind of the starting point. I get what you're saying. It's kind of a moot point as to, one tree, big old man radiator on a property, does that constitute a seed source? Probably not. And it would just be one of those factors that an authorised person would take into consideration.
If I could, I only brought it up because this was part of the arguments made at the hearing by plantation owners, raising, oh, there's a lot of doubt, there's a lot of doubt, there's a lot of doubt. If at all possible, we should have removed doubt. And that's the reason, because it's already been raised by plantation owners. How can you prove, and so on.
Thank you. Do staff, I'm just wondering if we can get this through today with a change, or I'm just wondering if we need to have a break at some point for that to be considered.
Yeah, no, it would probably be helpful to have a quick break just to get some wording sorted to bring back.
Okay, so we'll take, it's 11:20, so it's time we had a break anyway, so we'll take perhaps a 15-minute break. Oh, okay, so 10 minutes, yeah, sure, 10 minutes. Back at past, everybody. Okay, thank you for people on Zoom. We're actually back underway again. So I think the outcome of that is that we're going to have some word changes, and that will mean that it's more likely to be moved. It's on the screen. So we've just got another rule to. We finished all the rules?
No, there's 3 more rules.
3 more rules to go. So,
I just wonder, in bringing in these kind of rules, other councils, did they tackle legacy pines, legacy conifers, or not?
Are you talking in terms of the other councils who've brought rules in previously?
About the country, because I think I heard you say that we're the last to bring in these kind of rules.
You're the last councils to bring in the rules for councils that have operational programs happening under the national program. So, and there's a reason for that, because the national program started later in the Red Hills and the Dun Mountain area than other places like, mid Canterbury, for example. But it's just that another, as Rob said, on that path to better management all round.
If I may, just to clarify, we consulted on a rule that covered legacy conifers. We're changing it so we're not covering legacy. Other councils, when they brought in their rules, did they only look forward, or were they also addressing the problem of legacy conifers?
My take on it is they were drawing a line in the sand, and they were trying to deal with pest conifers that were creating a problem. From now on, the intent wasn't to address the legacy rules for all the reasons that Rob mentioned. When I think of legacy pines, I think of catchment boards previously planting in the head of catchments, Pinus contorta, 30, 40 years ago. I accept that legacy could be a lot later than that, but I would contend that new Rule B doesn't have too much bearing on this issue for the council. It's one that could easily be accepted and recommended to be the way to go. It's for a whole lot of reasons very difficult to address that legacy spread.
Thank you. I think we can move on to Rule C.
Got one clarifying question. So the other councils, did they have a Rule B like we had originally? 'Cause we consulted on Rule B. Did the other councils have a Rule B like that?
No, Madam Chair, the other councils don't have a rule that places a liability on spread from one party onto a neighbouring property.
Thank you. Seeing we're going through rule by rule, can we move on to rule C, please?
Okay, so this is a pest agent conifer rule. So if you cast your mind to the feral stray cat pest agent rule, so an excellent example of that is where you've got a companion cat mating with a wild cat and producing more pest agent cats, if you like. So that's a simple one to explain. In the wild and conifer world, it's a bit harder to explain what this is because you've got that the 1 hectare and over definition of what is a plantation forest, therefore exempt from the rules. So the best way I can describe the pest agent rule is for an example, a Douglas fir shelter belt that's less than 1 hectare, that's not covered by that plantation rule. So therefore it could be a pest agent in terms of spreading issues onto the neighbouring property. That's what the intent of this rule is, addressing essentially the control of conifer woodlots and shelter belts under that 1 hectare size. But there has to be, the person making the complaint is still subject to some of those same rules. That person has to be taking reasonable steps to control their conifers on their property, and those definitions have been outlined. So I think it is a useful rule. It's more designed to cater for those smaller scale issues.
Thank you. So questions? So Stanhope?
Thanks, Chair Butler. In this case, pest agent conifer, of the 12, is it just the 10 or is it the 12?
Potentially it could apply to any of the 12 if they're in a plantation under 1 hectare.
So just to follow up, and also the wording, the last sentence around management agency and occupier, are we really just talking about 2 adjacent landowners? Is that, who is the management agency in this case?
In this, the management agency is the council.
Yeah.
And so it would be a negotiated agreement between the council, an authorised person, and the occupier who has the land with the pest agent tree on it.
Okay, thanks. And just in terms of the impact of this rule, that means if anyone's got a shelter belt in one of the 12 species of tree and an adjacent landowner clears their land, they can require that shelter belt to be taken down?
Well, again, it's got to be in the opinion of an authorised person with similar tests to the other rule, and it has to be proven to be a genuine source of seed spread. So again, there's quite a high bar there in that assessment to be made. And yeah, so some of those, that assessment will have those same subjective things applied to it as we've just discussed in that previous rule.
Or to clarify, because you can have that negotiated agreement, it might be that there's an undertaking to manage any spread from that shelter belt. So you're not automatically requiring the worst outcome. It could be an agreement between.
Thank you.
So, yep, Councillor Bench.
Could the farmer and the forester, if you had a kilometre of boundary and there was seedlings on it, could you come to agreement to do nothing?
Potentially following negotiation, so that the farmer, I guess the neighbour that's would have raised a complaint in the first instance, and therefore they'd probably be unlikely to accept do nothing, but that may be an outcome if they decide to be.
But legally, they probably don't have to do anything. So if I went to the forester and said, you know, I want to get rid of all this, then he said, I'll give you hunting rights to this place. Oh, okay. You wouldn't need to do anything, would you?
No.
It would become a forestry block. Okay.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on to the next one.
So rules D and E in relation to the operational areas only. So there's 4 areas mentioned: the Mount Richmond Wilding Conifer Unit, the Takaka Hill Community Project, Able Tasman Project Janzoon, and the Project Divine work. So they are named operational areas that are underway. They've had national funding or local funding. So again, these rules have come straight out of the genesis of these rules were from the ECAN, were the first council off the rank, and they developed these rules to protect their investment, protect all the gains that have been made, so that landowners would eventually be liable for all control work, but after a program has been worked through. So Rule D is about landowners being responsible for ongoing control work in any of those 4 named operational areas. But it follows a program of control work having occurred previously. So initial control, maintenance control, levels get down to a level where landowners are deemed responsible for ongoing control work, and then that rule kicks in. So I have to emphasise that for this region, for your guys' regions, that those operations are not at the stage yet where they're into that maintenance phase and looking at rolling off. There are some areas in Canterbury and the Mackenzie country, Godley, around that area, the Mackenzie, where they are into that phase of landowner roll off and they are trialing areas. So Tasman Nelson's not there yet, but the intent is for this rule to be there for the future when that work is deemed complete and the landowner carries on the responsibility for wilding conifer control. So that's Rule D. Rule E is essentially a similar. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I just wanted to mention here that the Nelson City Council reserves, the Moreton Rating reserves, are probably in a maintenance phase. So we talk about the national program. It's probably more what you've been talking to. But our program's going on for 20, 30 years, and we are going around picking up the odd ones now. So but it's hard because it's public and handing it back to the landowner. We are the landowner. We are doing the control. So it's a bit separate to that national program.
Thank you. Okay, so moving on.
Yep. So in terms of submitters, I recall there was a couple of submitters in the Takaka Hill area who thought that rule was a bit too the onus was on too directed on them. But I'd like to point out this is a rule that was brought in. It's like a nationally applied rule, if you like, from the best advice. It's really to maintain the gains made, and the transition criteria have still not been sorted out between the regions and the management unit operators as to what constitutes a rollover. Get into a situation where landowners pick up the ongoing control work. That those criteria still haven't been sorted out. So there's still a bit of water to go under the bridge in terms of that process. But it is well down the track in Canterbury, and it's going to impact on these operations in the future. The slowdown of the regional or national program will probably push that out a bit more, but the intent is to have that rule there as, again, it's a fallback rule to make sure that those gains aren't wasted when the program finishes.
Thank you. So I've just got a question, I think, there, just about the proportion of actual private land in the operational areas, that actual private land as opposed to public land is quite small, is that right? And it's only the Takaka Hill.
It is so largely Takaka Hill, which did receive some national funding through their community funding model, and then Golden Bay would also include some private land as well.
So just a question which is just related, but what is the expectation for the operational areas to get funding? You mentioned, Peter, that it may be slowing down, but is there a commitment for funding for these operational areas to be, because otherwise, if they don't get the funding to do this, then it makes the rule kind of a bit moot, really.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I guess the answer to that is with the Jobs for Nature program nationally, there was a $25 million program instigated for 3 years that ended at the end of June last year, I think it was. And they're now back to a baseline funding of $10 million a year nationally. So the whole program is $15 million shy of where it should or could be based on the previous funding. So a lot of work was done and front loaded to do more work in those first few years. And now the road's been pulled a little bit back to baseline funding. So for those operations that had that sort of upfront funding, and I'm not sure if Mount Richmond was a recipient of that, it sounded like it was. So there was a lot of work put in at that front end to do more work, and then the baseline budget's kicked in. So it is what it is. It's a bit disappointing for those who have been involved in the industry. In terms of this rule, it's still the rule doesn't really impact that program, apart from when it kicks in, it might be delayed by a few years because of that flow of initial work through to maintenance work won't have been completed as quickly as they might have thought.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Yes.
For Peter, for you, Madam Chair.
Yeah.
Just in relation to that, and particularly around the Mount Richmond wilding conifer, and I'm not sure you're probably still coming to this, how will that be affected by the relationship with the Good Neighbour rule and the Crown? And I'm thinking particularly of DOC.
That is the focus for Rule E, essentially.
Yeah, so you can do you want to answer it now or when we get there?
Up to you, Madam Chair. We're kind of at that stage,
Yeah,
are we?
I think we're at that stage now. So this is the last rule.
Yep. So this rule is it's a good neighbour rule. So I think your council has several good neighbour rules. So it's the same principle applied, that the neighbour has to be responsible for pest control. So boiling it down, back prior to 2015, the Crown did not have to be bound to a pest management plan rule ever, unless they agreed to informally. So bringing in good neighbour rules was a way to make the Crown responsible for control on their land. So we're talking basically DOC land and LINZ land and Defence Force land for some regions. So the Crown took put a lot of effort into working through what that meant for their land, and in the end, they agreed to have a good neighbour rule instigated into pest plans, but limiting their liability for control work. So for most plants and animals that they settled on a 200-metre boundary, there's no real science behind it apart from the majority of plant pest seeds fall into that, first couple of 100 metres. There are exceptions. Pampas will, blow 25 kilometres, for example, but by and large, in many situations, 200 metres is a boundary control rule, so that got applied nationally. So this rule kind of fell out of Rule D, in that it became the only way to bind the Crown to adhere to a rule in a pest management plan. The Crown wouldn't accept any liability for a Rule D situation, but for a Rule E situation, they would. So what is the good neighbour rule? It applies to any neighbour. It's really designed to bind the Crown for that rule. So again, the same process applies. It's for those 4 operational areas where prior work has been done, initial control work through to maintenance control work. Again, the operations in this region are quite different. They're not at that stage. Other areas that we've worked in, like Mid-Dome and Northern Southland, they've been doing control work there for 20 years, and it's now at the stage of being handed over to Doc and Linds, who own big parts of that land. So again, they would be, their liability is limited to that 200 metres. That's what the intent is, and that's where this rule came from.
Okay, so questions? No. So any looks like there's no concerns and there's understanding about that role. So we now move on to the resolution, but you've got a comment.
Thanks. So just on the resolution, actually, if you stop there on N, the last sentence is in a state of transition. Should it be to be managed by land occupiers? It just didn't make sense. Thanks. And then a general question for officers is what happens from here. So today, if we adopt these resolutions, does that then mean that the new strategy comes into force? And is this the end of this really lovely process that we've all been part of? Because it's been surprisingly enjoyable. Or do we I'm assuming that this updated strategy goes to both councils, but do we have another meeting, or does it just go straight from here to both councils for adoption?
Yeah, this is the end. If you are happy to make these recommendations, it goes straight to both councils to be adopted. This joint committee would recommend to those 4 councils.
Thank you, through the chair. Rules, let me see. Rules A and C, and possibly one of the subsequent rules, they end with something like, unless there's a negotiated agreement. The wording for A is or unless, and the wording for C is or. So I just wonder if it just should be, just to keep that tidy, is the intention to be unless in both cases?
It should be unless there's a agreement in place, I believe.
It sounds like yes, remove the or there, and going down to rule C is changing an or to unless.
Correct, Madam Chair. Yep, that would be my reading.
Councillor Kinnermore.
Yeah. That or.
You got a question?
No, but I just want to thank all the staff for the huge amount of work that's gone in behind the scene. I know it's your pay job, but there's a lot of work that's gone on behind here, a lot of passion, a lot of, how can I explain it? The job very, very well done. And I just personally want to thank you for everything that you've done that I don't know about, it's going on behind the scenes. So thank you.
So, councillor Stella.
Thanks. It was just some more tidying up. We discussed previously about some wording that is correct in A, whereby it might be correct in B, where an occupier is taking reasonable steps to control wilding conifers, and that wording I think needs to be copied down into C, and replace undertaking proactive work and so on. That might be something we could do, pause, or just do it live. How would the chair like to handle this process?
Wait,
I think in rule B, about halfway through it, there's the phrase, occupier must be taking reasonable steps to control wilding conifers. And that needs to be copied and taken into C to replace where it's talking about proactive wilding conifer control. Taking guidance from staff, I think that's what staff said.
Yep, no, that would be correct, Madam Chair. That it should be consistent wording.
Thank you. So, councillor Sanson.
I'd be really happy to move it if there's a Tasman councillor who'd be happy to second.
Okay, the resolution's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion?
So I'm speaking in support of this. I guess, first of all, I didn't really have any idea coming into this what it would be like. It seems to be quite a dry subject matter, but it's been surprisingly interesting. And I think, really the staff and Peter, you just have a wealth of knowledge. All of us have really valued your guidance, your insight into the complexities of these issues and the importance of this strategy, and how it overlaps with other bylaws and regulations and that kind of thing. So I just really want to thank you for making it accessible and understandable for a layperson. I really want to thank all the submitters. We had more submitters than I was expecting, and obviously a lot of support for things like cat control and wilding conifer control. So I think that that's really affirming of the work that we're doing. And then I think, Peter, just your depth of experience in the kind of wilding space and also the, I guess, pest management space in general. It's just been really wonderful to see that. And I think, our region is definitely going to be the better for this outcome. So I just want to thank you for that. And encourage, it's been a pleasure to work with you all, encourage you all to support it, and thanks for it. It's been a very enjoyable experience.
Thank you, Councillor Simpson. I think my comment would be that this is, a piece of the jigsaw, and that it doesn't stand alone. It stands with all the other measures that we have, different types of strategies to try and improve our environment. So I'd like to just pay tribute to Deputy Mayor Bryant, who actually was chair of this committee for a long, long time, from the beginning of the pest management plan. Yeah. And I'd like to thank the staff again, and Winnie for all the work, all of you. So I will put the resolution. So all those in favour? Aye. Against? Carried. Right, thank you. Well,
3 years.
Oh, do closing karakia.
yes, so if we decide to close with the karakia, thank you, Councillor.
Kia ora. Tui ki runga, tui ki raro, tui ki roto, tui ki waho, tui e tātou te tangata, ki te kaupapa o te hui nei, ki te kaupapa o te rangi nei. Māori ora ki e tātou katoa. Kia ora.
Okay, so meeting closed. Thank you, everybody, for all your efforts.